Lucas Donovan sat on the worn-out bench at the park, his arms resting on his knees as he watched his 8-year-old daughter, Felicity, chase after a butterfly. His clothes were a little frayed, his boots scuffed, but his eyes were full of warmth as he kept a close watch over her. He let out a breath, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The autumn air was crisp, biting at his skin, but he was used to it. Life hadn't been easy since Felicity's mother walked out on them, leaving him to juggle 2 jobs just to make ends meet. But no matter how hard things got, he never let his daughter see his struggle. A woman's sigh pulled his attention away from Felicity. Next to him, a woman sat, her arms crossed, her gaze distant. She was beautiful, with sharp blue eyes and long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. But there was something about her expression, something lonely. "Rough day?" Lucas asked casually. She blinked as if she hadn't noticed him before. "You could say that." He nodded toward the coffee cup in her hands. "That stuff helps, but only a little." She let out a short laugh. "Yeah, well, it's either this or a full bottle of wine, but that would be frowned upon in a public park." Lucas chuckled. "Depends on the day you've had." She turned to him, finally taking him in. His strong jaw, the slight stubble, the tired but kind eyes. He looked like someone who carried too much weight on his shoulders, yet still found a way to smile. "You don't look like you've had it easy either," she observed. He shrugged. "Life's not always fair, but I've got my little girl." "That's all that matters." She followed his gaze to Felicity, who was now trying to do a cartwheel in the grass. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "She's adorable." "Thanks, she's the best thing in my world." His voice softened with pride. They sat in silence for a moment, just watching the world move around them. "I'm Francesca Caldwell," she finally said, sticking out her hand. "Lucas Donovan," he replied, shaking it. "So what do you do, Lucas Donovan?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I work construction when I can, and sometimes I do odd jobs, nothing fancy." She tilted her head, intrigued. "You say that like it's something to be ashamed of." He huffed a laugh. "It's not. Just people tend to judge, you know." Francesca nodded, understanding more than he realized. "You?" he asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated. "I work in finance." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Finance, huh? Sounds important. You could say that." She took a sip of her coffee, not elaborating. Before he could press further, Felicity ran up to them, breathless. "Daddy." "Did you see my cartwheel?" Lucas grinned. "That was the best cartwheel I've ever seen." Felicity beamed up at Francesca, her curiosity piqued. "Who's this?" "This is Francesca," Lucas introduced. "She was having a rough day, so we're keeping her company." Felicity gave Francesca a big, toothy grin. "Daddy says that when someone's sad, you should always make them smile." Francesca's heart clenched. This little girl, this man were complete strangers, yet they had already made her feel less alone than she had in years. "Well, your daddy is a very smart man," Francesca said softly. Lucas chuckled. "Don't tell her that." "She'll never let me live it down." Felicity giggled before running off again. Francesca turned back to Lucas. "You're a good father." "I try." They stayed there for another hour, talking about nothing and everything. Lucas had no idea that the woman sitting next to him was one of the wealthiest CEOs in the country. And Francesca had no idea why, for the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. Francesca wasn't sure what compelled her to return to the park the next day, but she found herself walking the familiar path, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Maybe it was the fresh air, or maybe it was the way Lucas had looked at his daughter with a love so pure and unwavering that it made her chest tighten. She spotted them before they saw her. Felicity was skipping ahead, her brown curls bouncing as she waved a twig like a magic wand. Lucas trailed behind, his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, his expression easy and content. Francesca hesitated. She had meetings to attend, emails to answer, an entire empire to oversee. Yet, none of it ever made her feel as grounded as sitting on that park bench with a man who had no idea who she really was. Lucas noticed her first, his eyebrows raising slightly in surprise. "Back again," she shrugged, a playful glint in her eyes. "I figured I owed you a coffee after yesterday," he chuckled. "I won't say no to that." Felicity ran up, beaming. "You came back." "I did." Francesca knelt to the girl's height. "I wanted to see if you perfected that cartwheel." Felicity's face lit up. I did. Wanna see? Absolutely. As Felicity dashed off to demonstrate, Francesca handed Lucas a coffee. He took it with a nod of thanks, their fingers briefly brushing. You know, he mused, most people don't come to the park 2 days in a row just to sit on a bench. She took a sip of her drink. Maybe I just like the view. Lucas studied her, something unreadable in his gaze. Or maybe you just needed a break from whatever life you're running from. Francesca stiffened. He wasn't wrong, but she wasn't used to people seeing through her so easily. I'm not running, she said carefully. Just reevaluating. Lucas nodded as if he understood more than she realized. Fair enough. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Felicity attempt another cartwheel. So, he said eventually, this finance job of yours must be important if it's got you this stressed. She exhaled slowly. It is, but sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. Lucas tilted his head. Why wouldn't it be? She hesitated. Because success can be lonely. He watched her, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe you're measuring success the wrong way. Her breath caught. No one had ever said that to her before. Before she could respond, Felicity ran back, slightly breathless. Did you see? Was it better? Francesca smiled. It was practically perfect. Felicity grinned before turning to Lucas. Daddy, can we get ice cream? Lucas pulled out his wallet and frowned at its contents. Francesca saw the hesitation in his eyes, the way he glanced at Felicity like he didn't want to disappoint her. Without thinking, she spoke. I'd love some ice cream too, my treat. Lucas looked at her sharply. You don't have to do that, I know. She met his gaze steadily. But I want to. He studied her for a long moment before sighing. All right, but I'm paying next time, she laughed. We'll see about that. As they walked toward the small ice cream stand, Francesca realized something strange she hadn't thought about work once since she arrived. And for the first time in a long time, the weight on her shoulders didn't feel so heavy. Lucas adjusted the strap of the toolbox over his shoulder as he stepped into the grand marble lobby of the Caldwell financial headquarters. His steel-toed boots echoed against the polished floors, drawing a few raised eyebrows from sharply dressed executives who hurried past him. He was used to it, people looking at him like he didn't belong in places like this. But he wasn't here for them. He was here for a job. The maintenance supervisor, a wiry man named Greg, met him at the reception desk. Mr. Donovan, right? Lucas nodded. That's me. Elevator on the 22nd floor's been acting up. We need a full assessment before the CEO arrives for a late meeting. Think you can handle it? Lucas gave a half smile. Wouldn't be here if I couldn't. Greg clapped him on the back. Good man. Take the service stairs up. Executives don't like maintenance using their elevators. Lucas didn't take offense. He'd worked enough jobs to know how things were. He made his way up, adjusting his grip on his toolbox. The last few days had been lighter than usual, thanks to Francesca. He hadn't expected to see her again after that first day at the park, but she kept showing up. And each time, she peeled back a little more of herself, revealing a woman who carried the weight of something she didn't talk about. Now, as he climbed the stairs, he shook off the thought. Francesca Caldwell was the only person who made him forget, even for a little while, that life had been relentless. He reached the 22nd floor, stepping out into a sleek, modern hallway lined with glass offices. He spotted the malfunctioning elevator and set his toolbox down, rolling up his sleeves. Then, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. Lucas, he turned sharply. Standing just outside a glass-walled office was Francesca, her usual composed expression shattered by pure shock. She wasn't in her casual park attire now. She wore a fitted navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her dark hair pinned back in an elegant twist. Lucas straightened. Francesca. She took a step forward, glancing between him and the toolbox at his feet. What are you doing here? Fixing an elevator, he said simply. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. A clipped voice interrupted them. Miss Caldwell, the board is waiting. Lucas turned to see a tall, severe-looking woman standing a few feet away, holding a leather portfolio. Francesca nodded, regaining her composure. I'll be there in a moment. The woman hesitated but then walked away. Lucas exhaled slowly. So you're the CEO. She pressed her lips together before nodding. I was going to tell you. Lucas let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Were you? Yes, she stepped closer. I didn't know how. He studied her, his jaw tightening. And what? You thought it wouldn't matter, she flinched. I didn't want it to. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. You should have told me, Francesca. I know. Her voice was softer now. When I'm with you, none of this matters. I can just be me, he exhaled, forcing himself to push past the sting of feeling like an idiot. I don't care how much money you have, Francesca, but I do care about honesty. She swallowed hard. I didn't mean to lie, I like not being seen as the CEO for once. I like just being Francesca. Lucas studied her for a long moment before nodding. I get it, I do. She took a cautious step closer. Can we talk later, please? He met her gaze. There was something raw there, something real. Finally, he sighed. Yeah. We can talk later. Relief flashed across her face. Thank you. Lucas turned back to his work, trying to ignore the strange twist in his chest as she walked away. Lucas adjusted Felicity's coat, making sure the buttons were fastened properly before they stepped out into the crisp evening air. She giggled, bouncing on her toes, excited for their usual walk to the park. But tonight, his thoughts were elsewhere. Francesca. It had been a week since he found out who she really was. Since then, she had tried to reach out, leaving messages he hadn't answered, stopping by the park only to find that he and Felicity weren't there. He wasn't avoiding her. Not exactly. He just wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between their worlds. Felicity tugged his hand, pulling him toward the park entrance. Daddy, look. He followed her gaze and felt his chest tighten. Francesca stood by their usual bench, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her gaze searching the crowd. The moment she spotted them, relief washed over her features. Lucas exhaled slowly. He had to face this. Felicity, never one to hesitate, ran ahead and threw her arms around Francesca's waist. You're back. Daddy said you were busy, but I missed you. Francesca knelt, pressing a kiss to the top of Felicity's head. I missed you too, sweetheart. Lucas approached, his expression unreadable. Francesca straightened, her hands gripping the edges of her coat. You finally decided to stop running from me, she said softly. He met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. I needed time. I know, Felicity tugged at Lucas's hand. Can we sit? Lucas nodded, and the three of them settled onto the bench. Francesca turned to him, determination in her eyes. I need you to understand something. I never meant to deceive you. I just wanted to be around someone who saw me as more than a title, more than a paycheck, and you did. Lucas sighed, rubbing his hands together. It's not about the money, Francesca. I know, she whispered. That's why she paused, gathering her thoughts. I don't care about any of that when I'm with you. It's the first time in years I've felt like myself. Lucas studied her, searching for any trace of dishonesty, but there was none, only raw, unguarded truth. Felicity, ever perceptive, leaned against Francesca's arm. Are you sad? Francesca blinked rapidly, as if holding back emotion. A little. Felicity grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. Daddy always says when someone's sad, you should make them smile. Lucas's chest tightened. That had been the very first thing that connected them. Francesca let out a soft laugh. Your daddy is a very wise man. Lucas shifted, exhaling. I don't know how this works, Francesca, your world and mine. She reached for his hand, her fingers tentative but warm. Then let's figure it out together. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her. The weight of the world might try to pull them apart, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Felicity grinned, completely oblivious to the depth of the moment. Does this mean we can all get ice cream again? Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, kiddo, I think it does. Francesca squeezed his hand. Then let's go. As they walked, Lucas realized something. He might have thought their worlds were too different, but the truth was simpler than that. Love had a way of bridging any distance. And looking at Francesca beside him, with Felicity skipping ahead, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. Lucas adjusted the strap of Felicity's backpack as they walked down the quiet evening streets, the city lights flickering above them. Francesca walked beside him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, a thoughtful expression on her face. They had spent the afternoon together, just the three of them. Ice cream, laughter, a slow walk through the park. It had felt easy, natural. Yet, underneath it all, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that their differences weren't something they could simply ignore. Francesca glanced at him, her brow slightly furrowed. "You're quiet." He shifted his grip on Felicity's hand. "Just thinking." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "About us," Lucas nodded. "I don't want to be another thing you have to manage." Her steps slowed, and she turned to face him. "Is that what you think this is?" He met her gaze, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "Your life is planned down to the minute. Meetings, decisions, responsibilities. I don't fit into that world." Her expression softened. "Lucas, you aren't something I need to fit into my schedule. You're someone I want in my life." Felicity, sensing the shift in the conversation, swung their joined hands playfully. "Daddy, can she come over for dinner?" Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't waste time, do you?" Francesca smiled at Felicity before looking back at him. "I'd love to," he hesitated. Letting her into his space, into the world he had built for his daughter, was different from their walks in the park, but Felicity was already grinning, hopeful. And deep down, he wanted Francesca there too. "All right," he finally said. "Tomorrow night." Francesca's face lit up. "I'll be there." The following evening, Lucas stood in the small kitchen of their modest apartment, stirring a pot on the stove. Felicity sat at the tiny dining table, swinging her legs as she talked about her day. The apartment was nothing special, clean but lived in, with second-hand furniture and drawings taped to the walls. It was a home, even if it wasn't extravagant. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Lucas wiped his hands on a towel before opening it. Francesca stood there, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "I didn't know what to bring, but I figured these were safe." Lucas stepped aside, letting her in. "They're nice, thank you." Felicity ran up, taking the flowers with excitement. "I'll put them in water." Francesca watched as the little girl hurried off, then turned back to Lucas. "This is nice." He glanced around. "It's small." "It's home," she corrected. They moved to the kitchen, and Francesca leaned against the counter, watching him cook. "I didn't know you could cook," Lucas shrugged. "I had to learn. When it's just you and a kid, you figure things out fast." She watched him for a moment, something unreadable in her expression. "I like seeing you like this." He raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Comfortable." "At ease." Lucas focused on the pot in front of him. "It's not always easy." Francesca hesitated before speaking. "I know that, and I don't want to make things harder for you." He glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. She continued, "I don't know where this is going, but I don't want to let it go because of fear." Lucas set the spoon down, turning fully to face her. "It's not fear, it's reality. Our lives are different." She stepped closer. "Then let's find a way to make them work together." Before he could respond, Felicity came running back with a vase, proudly setting it on the table. "There, now we can eat." Dinner was warm, filled with conversation and laughter. Francesca listened as Felicity talked about school, offering encouragement and asking questions that made the little girl beam with excitement. Lucas watched them, something shifting in his chest. After the meal, Francesca helped clear the table, moving through the small kitchen as if she had always belonged there. When the dishes were done and Felicity had gone to bed, Lucas walked her to the door. She paused before stepping out. "Tonight meant a lot to me," he exhaled slowly. "Yeah. Me too." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't need grand gestures, Lucas. I just need you." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "Then let's figure this out." A slow smile spread across her face. "I'd like that." As she walked away, Lucas stood in the doorway, watching until she disappeared down the hall. Maybe their worlds weren't as incompatible as he had thought. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something new together. Lucas walked through the city streets, the cool night air brushing against his skin. His thoughts were tangled, caught somewhere between uncertainty and something far more dangerous, hope. Francesca had become a constant in his life, slipping into the spaces he hadn't realized were empty. She had woven herself into Felicity's world so effortlessly that Lucas sometimes wondered how they had ever gone without her. But the reality of who she was and who he was still loomed over him, a silent question neither of them dared to voice. He reached his apartment building and climbed the stairs, unlocking the door. Felicity was already asleep, her small body curled beneath the blankets. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Then his phone buzzed. Francesca. For a second, he considered letting it go to voicemail, but something inside him refused to pull away from her. He answered. "Hey." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Can you come over?" Lucas frowned. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause. Then I need you. That was all it took. An hour later, Lucas found himself stepping into Francesca's penthouse for the first time. The sheer contrast between her world and his was staggering. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering city skyline, sleek modern furniture filled the space, and everything smelled faintly of vanilla and something expensive he couldn't name. But none of that mattered. Not when he saw her standing in the middle of the room, arms wrapped around herself, her expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him. "Francesca," she turned, her blue eyes searching his face. "I don't know how to do this." Lucas stepped closer. "Do what?" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Let someone in, trust that they'll stay." His chest tightened. "I'm not going anywhere." Her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to believe him but didn't know how. Lucas reached for her, his hands settling on her arms. "I know what this looks like. I know the world sees you as this untouchable powerhouse, and maybe you've learned to live that way, but that's not what I see." Her breath hitched. He continued, his voice steady. "I see the woman who sat on a park bench and laughed at my bad jokes. The woman who knelt down to tie my daughter's shoelace like it was the most natural thing in the world. The woman who doesn't need to have all the answers because I'm standing right here and we can figure it out together." Francesca swallowed hard. "What if I mess this up?" Lucas gave a soft chuckle. "Then we fix it, that's how this works." For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly she stepped into him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his chest. Lucas held her, his chin resting against the top of her head, feeling the way she melted into him. "I don't want to lose this," she whispered. "You won't." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet certainty of each other. Weeks passed, and with them, the walls between them crumbled. Francesca spent more time at Lucas's apartment than she did in her own, finding comfort in the simplicity of it. Lucas found himself slipping into her world as well, attending charity events by her side, enduring the wary glances of her colleagues who couldn't understand why their powerful CEO had chosen a man who worked with his hands. But Francesca never wavered. One evening, as they sat on her balcony, wine glasses in hand, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I want you to meet my family." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "The same family that's been conveniently out of town every time I asked about them." She laughed softly. "That's the one." "Why now?" She hesitated. "Because I love you." Lucas sucked in a breath. Francesca met his gaze, no hesitation in her eyes. "I love you, Lucas, and I don't care if the rest of the world doesn't understand, I just need you to." He set his glass down, reaching for her. "I do." Then he kissed her, slow and deep, pouring every unspoken word into the space between them. The dinner with her family was tense, at least at first. Francesca's father, a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, studied Lucas with open skepticism. Her mother was polite but distant, and her younger brother, Theo, seemed more curious than anything else. Lucas held his own, answering their questions with quiet confidence, refusing to be intimidated. But it wasn't until Francesca reached for his hand under the table, lacing their fingers together, that he knew he had nothing to prove. By the end of the evening, Theo clapped him on the back and declared him not terrible, which Lucas supposed was a victory. As they walked out, Francesca squeezed his hand. "Thank you," Lucas glanced at her. "For what?" "For standing beside me, for not running." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." Months later, on a quiet evening in the park where it all began, Lucas knelt in front of Francesca, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Francesca's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth. Lucas exhaled, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I never thought I'd have this someone who challenges me, pushes me, loves me despite everything. But you do. And I love you, Francesca Caldwell. So if you'll have me, if you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving that love to you, then marry me." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her, Felicity cheered from the bench where she had been watching. The wedding was intimate, a perfect blend of their worlds. Francesca, stunning in a simple yet elegant gown, walked down the aisle toward the man who had changed everything. Lucas, dressed in a tailored suit that felt foreign but worth it, watched her with an expression that left no doubt. When they said their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And as Lucas kissed his wife with Felicity spinning in circles beside them, laughing in delight, he knew this was the life he had never dared to dream of. But it was his, and it always would be.